Hello, welcome back. I'm here with Esther Eidenau today, who is from the Classics department at Nottingham, and she's an expert in ancient Greek myth and ritual and religion. We're here to talk about the relationship between myth and the study of ideology. So Esther, why should students of ideology care about myth?
So myth and ideology meet in the arena of belief. Our word myth comes from the Greek word mythos, but we actually use the words very differently. So in our use of myth, we use it to refer to widely held beliefs that are wrongly held, but that wasn't what it meant for the Greeks.
So what are the key characteristics of myth for the ancient Greeks?
There's no one definition, but there are three characteristics that come up regularly. So myths are generally held to be traditional. They pass down through communities. They are narrative, so they're stories, tales that are told, and they are socially relevant. So they encapsulate social beliefs, social principles and ideas. And I'd actually add a fourth, which is that they are adaptable. So one of the reasons why myth is so sticky down through time is the way in which that it responds to other cultures' myths and also to current events among the people where the myth is being told.
So if I understand this correctly, they're about much more than just religion, right?
Yes, absolutely. There is a closer relationship between myth and religion. In part, that's because of the content of myth, which is often about gods and monsters, nymphs, those kinds of things. But and you often find that religious ritual and myth relate to each other, but they don't directly map. So you get myth without ritual and rituals without myth. But myths are about much more than just religious aspects. They describe the world around us fundamentally. They are ideologies. They give reasons for why the world is the way it is. So why territory is the shape it is, the birth of the gods, relationships between men and women. And specifically to the point of ideology, they also often are used to legitimize power.
Okay, so most of the myths we know are stories. Can you tell us a little bit more about the kind of narrative form of myth?
Well, stories, yes. Stories, it's an instinctive human approach to explaining our world, to do it through a narrative form. And stories are very interesting, and one of the reasons why myth is so sticky is because of the narrative form that it uses. It also makes it very powerful. A myth as a story is able to communicate information, but it also makes us feel. So stories can divide communities, they can bring them together, they can promote particular ideas. And we see this idea actually used by Plato in the Laws and the Republic, two dialogues that he wrote. And there he actually says that myth is a very powerful form of persuasion, and he legislates for the kinds of myths that he wants people to be allowed to tell.
That sounds very much like an ideology. So are myths a form of ideology?
Oh yes, I think we can certainly see that. For example, in the Athenian use of the myths around Theseus, we see that very clearly. There are lots of ways in which the Athenians and Theseus relate to each other, but one of the clearest is around the relationship between the Athenians and the Persians. So when the Persians there's a series of wars between the Greeks and the Persians, and we can see the myths about Theseus changing emphasis according to whether the Athenians are invading Persian territory or the Persians are invading Athenian territory. We also can see how widespread that belief is from the stories that we're told, for example, about the Athenians believing that Theseus was fighting alongside them. That's a story told about the Battle of Marathon. And then later we actually see at the beginning of the Battle of Plataea, when the Athenians are arguing about where they should stand in the Greek lineup, they use that myth that Theseus defended Attica against the Amazons to explain why they should be in a particular position in the lineup to defend Greece against the Persians.
Mm-hmm. So we know these stories, but do we know whether the Greeks really believed in them, or were they just convenient stories?
That question is a long-running debate in scholarship on this area, and it is in fact the title of a book by a man called Paul Vane. And it's quite an interesting question in the sense that it helps us to think not just about Greek myth, but also about our relationship with Greek myth and our relationship with beliefs more generally. So Vane argues that over time, we create cultural programs of truths that we're allowed to believe in, that we restructure. And each era recreates that structure so that they have a different set of beliefs. They adapt their beliefs over time. This doesn't mean that anything goes, but it certainly means that that myth, that beliefs in general, can shift and change in response, as we've talked about with myth specifically. But I don't think that we should therefore think that beliefs, that myths specifically, are being cynically manipulated. One of the reasons that they're so long-lived is that they're very sticky, but that's because that they encapsulate truths. And this is something that, again, we can actually go back to a Greek writer to think about, Pausanias. He's writing during the Roman period, but in Greek, and he goes around Greece writing about what he sees and hears, so we get a lot of information about myth. And he says at the beginning of his travels, he thought all these myths were just full of foolishness. But now, as he gets towards the end of that travel, he's realized that they are in fact hard to understand, but full of wisdom.
Thank you very much, Esther. So in the learning steps that follow, we will be exploring this theme, whether myths contain particular forms of wisdom that are perhaps difficult to express in other ways, and to what extent this is still true of political discourse today.